Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I once again would talk about this little subject. And the subject, of course, for those of you that don't know, is going to be over the potentially biggest fight in all of boxing, at least allegedly. And of course, this is going to be, or I should say, potentially, and this is going to be another conversation about the possibility of there being a Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. fight. And this, in my view, at the current moment in time, is probably the biggest fight in all of boxing. Both of these fighters are within my top five pound for pound list. Both of these fighters, I do believe, tend to be A-grade skilled fighters. I think that both of them, even though they're both good, multifaceted fighters, I believe that Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr., that they do have a little bit of different styles. Errol Spence tends to be a little bit more of the come forth and pressure you, even though he can box on the outside. But Errol Spence, mainly from what I've seen, what he usually likes to do is to come forward and try to break you down incrementally. Terence Crawford can do that as well, but mainly what he likes to do is to be on the outside, and he really tries to break you down incrementally from the outside by trying to out counter you and somewhat being on the back foot, especially in that of the southpaw position. And that is also going to be another factor in this fight that is going to be very interesting. How Terence Crawford is going to handle an elite southpaw fighter like that of an Errol Spence Jr., and also how Errol Spence Jr. is going to handle an elite southpaw fighter like that of a Terence Bud Crawford. And apparently, Terence Bud Crawford naturally is an orthodox fighter. But of course, for any of us that have trained or practiced in something, whether it be a sport or anything else, there are certain boxers that are naturally right-handed, or they may be left-handed, but they may mainly box in the other stance, mainly because they may be trained that way for a certain amount of time, and then they trained so much in that stance to where eventually they were so much more comfortable within that stance than what they were their original stance. For those of you, of course, that know both Andre Ward and Miguel Cotto, both of those fighters, I believe, are actual southpaw fighters, or they actually are both left-handed, but they both prefer to fight in that of the orthodox stance, probably similar to that of a Terence Bud Crawford. I think that Terence Bud Crawford is probably about 1 to 2 times better in the southpaw stance than what he is in his orthodox stance. But it is what it is. But anyways, overall, this is going to be a very interesting fight, and we are going to review a video by Mr. Boxing Eagle. And of course, Mr. Boxing Eagle, we both know, who he is going to cheer for in this fight. It seems like he is rooting for that of Errol Spence Jr., and that's not me saying that he does not like Terence Bud Crawford, but he is rooting for that of an Errol Spence Jr. What I'll be saying is this is really a razor thin fight. And the reason why I thought that I would commentate on this video is because this is kind of going to be my incremental breakdown of what I think both fighters are going to have to watch out for in the fight and what both fighters bring to the table for each opponent. So it's going to be very, very interesting, or for one another. But anyways, Mr. Boxing Eagle is going to talk about it. Let's tune in.
I mean, I know I'm in the minority, but I think Spence. I think Spence is, he got the work rate, he got the power. He's the naturally bigger man. He's a naturally stronger man. Now, Crawford can box. He can box, beautiful boxer. I hate to go against him, but I just think Spence got this one.
Former heavyweight champion Hasim Rahman states that Errol Spence Jr.
Now, before we end up going super deep into the video, Mr. Hasim Rahman, or Rahman as Mr. Boxing Eagle calls him, and of course, for those of you that do not know him or remember him, he was a contender, I believe, back in the 90s for the heavyweight division, and that of the 2000s. I believe that if he wasn't the first one to defeat Lennox Lewis, I believe that he was the second and last one. They ended up beating him by knockout, but of course, Lennox Lewis, he was able to beat him in the rematch within the same rounds, actually, in the fourth round. One of the most brutal knockouts I've ever seen. But Hasim Rahman, I believe what he said is that he personally is going with that of Errol Spence Jr., not only because of the power, but I believe because of the pressure that he ends up putting on his opponents. And let me state this, because I had a person who I believe has been subscribed to my channel for a decently long time. Shout out to him. I believe the name is Mr. Lenar Thomas, but forgive me if I pronounce it wrong. I'm not always great with pronouncing names. But when it comes down to it overall, I believe that he said that he believes that Errol Spence Jr. is going to win the fight, which I could clearly see why. And I think one of the comments that he said in one of my last videos was that he does not believe that Terence Bud Crawford is as slick as, say, something like that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. or that of an Errol Lara, or that he can be slick, but he's not necessarily someone that, necessarily goes on the back foot as much as an Errol Lara or Floyd Mayweather Jr. Well, what I'll say is this. I actually believe that Terence Bud Crawford is very decently slick. I think that he's a very decently slick fighter. Now, the question is about Mr. Terence Bud Crawford is that will that work against that of an Errol Spence Jr.? And this is the biggest problem with Terence Bud Crawford that I see. The problem with Terence Bud Crawford, with me, at least one of his weaknesses, one of his very few flaws, the problem with Terence Bud Crawford, in my view, is not necessarily the level of slickness or his ability to be on the back foot. The problem is with Terence Bud Crawford is his defense at times. A lot of people, of course, with that style, when people take a look at a fighter that loves to move on the back foot, they always think that they're very highly defensive because of certain fighters in the past, like that of a Sweet Pea Pernell Whitaker or a Floyd Mayweather Jr. And Terence Bud Crawford is definitely not a bad defensive fighter, but he gets hit a little bit too much, in my view, for my liking. And Errol Spence sometimes will get hit a little bit more for my liking as well. But at least with Errol Spence Jr., what I'll say is this. I believe that he has the better all-around chin, and I think that he has the better punch resistance than that of a Terence Bud Crawford. That's not me saying that Terence Bud Crawford doesn't have a chin, but I've seen Terence Bud Crawford stunned in a few fights in his career. I've seen him stunned against Yuriorkis Gamboa. Now, of course, that was many fights ago, but I also seen him stunned against Aegis Velasquez. And Errol Spence Jr., I believe, is a harder puncher than any of the punchers that Terence Crawford has ever fought in his career. So the big question will be, is that if Terence Bud Crawford is going to be on the back foot here and there, which more than likely he will be, will his own punching power, talking about Terence Bud Crawford's, will his own punching power be enough to somewhat limit Errol Spence Jr. in certain exchanges? And on top of that, will it be able to keep him back? Will it maybe be able to limit Errol Spence Jr.'s attacks to a certain degree? And on top of that, will Terence Bud Crawford's defense be up to par enough to where he will not get caught enough by that of an Errol Spence Jr.? And I think that Terence Bud Crawford can take some shots here and there, but if Errol Spence continues to hit him, if Errol Spence Jr. lands one of those wicked left hooks, or excuse me, not a left hook, but one of those right hooks, or overall the left hand down the pipe, or just the punch overall in general to where he catches Terence Crawford in an exchange, that punch is going to hurt Terence Bud Crawford potentially very, very badly. Errol Spence Jr. has very, very explosive power for that of the welterweight division. He almost reminds me of a prime welterweight Miguel Cotto. For those of you that remember him, pretty much almost anyone he got into the ring with, he pretty much almost flattened. That's what Errol Spence Jr. reminds me of. So at the end of the day, Terence Bud Crawford is going to have to be very, very careful. That's the main problem I see with Terence Bud Crawford, is that his defense, in my view, is actually a little bit overrated. Even though I think that, he's very, somewhat decent defensively, he's not an Errol Lara in terms of the defense department, at least a prime Errol Lara. He's not a Floyd Mayweather Jr., and he's also not a Sweet Pea Pernell Whitaker. He's not on that level in terms of defense while being on the back foot. He's also not on that level in terms of defense on the front foot. And sometimes Terence Crawford, in my view, he gets in a little bit more exchanges and he gets hit a little bit more in those exchanges than what I would like him to. And Errol Spence Jr., even though, yes, he will get hit, he has a better chin, in my view, of the two. So the question will be, will Errol Spence Jr.'s pressure and will overall, that power, and if Terence Crawford gets hit, will Terence Crawford eventually be pounded into submission? Or overall, will he start to lose confidence because maybe the power doesn't affect Errol Spence Jr. as much as what it did prior opponents in the past? And on top of that, he's getting hit with shots and he gets wobbled here and there, or he's starting to get hurt. So maybe will that make Terence Crawford's offense a little bit more limited? Because depending on whatever sport you're in, I don't care if it's boxing, I don't care if it's the NFL, I don't care if it's the NBA, whatever it may be. For those of you that, for example, watch that of the NFL, my favorite team is that of the Carolina Panthers. For those of you that remember that won 2016 Super Bowl, the Carolina Panthers that year had the number one offense, and I believe the Denver Broncos had the number one defense. The Carolina Panthers, they were pretty much running over certain teams that year, but once they made it to the Super Bowl against the Denver Broncos had an excellent game plan, and the defense was so much in their face to where basically their offense was completely countered, and their offense, which looked like one of the greatest offenses of all time that season, became basically a kitten offense. It basically was not able to do anything within that Super Bowl. And that's what overall great defensive fighters overall are also able to do, especially if they have a great offense like that of an Errol Spence Jr. So Terence Crawford, in my view, in order to win the fight, he's going to have to tighten up his defense a little bit. Or at least all in all, he is going to have to watch out for that. But does that mean that I'm just 100% picking Errol Spence Jr. to win the fight? No, not necessarily, because this is really a razor-thin fight. But I'm also going to explain, in my view, what Errol Spence Jr. is going to have to do in the fight as well, as we continue along.
He's in the minority, but he believes that he'll beat Terence Crawford. That's what I want to talk about in this video.
You say you feel you're in the minority. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that most people lean towards Crawford?
Well, I think because Spence has had, the detached retina, the accident. He didn't look so hot in the last couple fights. He went the distance with Sean Porter. Crawford knocked him out. So I think people reading too much into that, and they feel as if Bud is a bigger puncher than Spence, which I don't think so. But so I think I'm in the minority, but I think Spence wins.
I think I'm in the minority, but I think
I don't necessarily think that Hasim Rahman, or however you pronounce his name, I don't think that he's too far off with what he's saying. I do believe that if people were to pick Terence Crawford, especially clearly over Errol Spence, that those pretty much would be the reasons why. And actually, I was one of those people when I seen Errol Spence Jr. in his last couple of fights, and the way that I seen Terence Crawford over that of a Sean Porter, I said, you know what? If Errol Spence performs against Terence Crawford the way that I seen him over Danny Garcia and that overall of a Sean Porter, I believe that Terence Crawford is going to beat him. But then he came back and he looked the best that he had looked in years against that of a Yordenis Ugas. Now, Yordenis Ugas is not on the same level as a Porter or some of those other guys in my view. And some may disagree with that, but it just is what it is. Yordenis Ugas is a very decent fighter, and what I will say is this. I certainly did pick Errol Spence Jr. to win that fight, but the way that he won that fight, pretty much, if he did drop around, it was only one. And on top of that, Errol Spence Jr., he pretty much completely pounded him into submission to the point to where another broken orbital eye bone was present in another one of his opponents. So Errol Spence Jr. looks very, very dangerous right now. His chin, I also believe, is better than that of Terence Bud Crawford's, as I said before. And he's actually a little bit of the better defensive fighter. Now, where Errol Spence Jr. does not have the advantages, in my view, against that of a Terence Bud Crawford, is that I do not think that he tends to be as good of a counterpuncher as Terence Crawford. I don't think that he is as fast in terms of hand speed or his foot speed as a Terence Bud Crawford. But just because someone's faster does not always mean that they're going to win the fight, as certain people, especially Conor McGregor, has said recently. That's the most recent man to be quoted with it. Timing beats speed. So at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, precision beats power and timing beats speed, as people would say. So the question will be is, can Errol Spence, can his timing overall beat Terence Crawford's speed and also his better, in my view, back foot ability or his quicker feet is going to be very particularly interesting. Because Terence Crawford, what I will say is this, I do not believe that he is as powerful as Errol Spence Jr. either, but he's not too far behind. I think a lot of people take a look at Terence Crawford, especially people who may be rooting for Errol Spence Jr. They may say, well, Terence Crawford is just too small. I don't think he's too small at all. I think that both Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Bud Crawford, maybe Errol Spence is a slightly bigger man, but Terence Crawford, make no mistake about it, he's a natural welterweight. People take a look at it and they say just because, he's 135, he started out there. Well, Oscar De La Hoya at one point in time, I believe, started out at either 130 or 135 as well. But for those of you that know the real weight of Oscar De La Hoya, especially once he started growing into himself, he eventually became a natural 147 to 154 pounder. So there are certain fighters that start off within those weight classes to where that's not really their natural weight, or the farther along they go, they're not really that natural weight. Terence Crawford has really, in my view, always been a natural welterweight. I think that he was able to make 135 once upon a time, but Terence Crawford, he pretty much always has been a decently big dude. So I don't think the size is going to be as much of a factor as what some people would say. But what I do think is that the power possibly could be. So we'll see what happens.
Spence wins. What up, Fight World? It's your boy Ego, and I'm back with some more boxing. That was former heavyweight champion of the world, famously knocked out Lennox Lewis and that was considered an upset at the time to capture titles. Lennox Lewis, of course, avenged that fight. He was giving his thoughts weighing in. Now, interesting thing from Hasim Rahman. Definitely his son's box. He's a student of the game. He's a fighter himself. And interesting thing, he said that he's in the minority here. And I honestly agree with him. I agree with him if we're referring to boxing legends. As you guys know, if you follow my channel, if you don't, oh well, that's your fault. But the boxing legends, majority of what I've seen outside of Hasim Rahman and Paulie Malignaggi, from Roy Jones Jr. to Antonio Tarver to Timothy Bradley and many more, they've picked Terence Crawford to beat Errol Spence. At the end of the day, anybody can have a fight prediction. I believe Robert Garcia even picked Terence Crawford to beat Errol Spence Jr. So at the end of the day, anybody can have an opinion and a prediction. It is a great fight. So no matter who you side with, you can make that argument. It's not like a blowout fight, like Terence Crawford, Mean Machine, where you can't really see Mean Machine pulling off the upset.
Well, thank you, sir, for at least saying that. Because you got these goddamn channels out here, and Ego kind of tends to be one of them as well. You got people out here like Dante's Boxing Nation and Aki TV who try to say this bullshit about how Terence Crawford, he's knocking out undefeated fighters. Like, Idris Velasquez, Jose Benavidez, and, Jeff Horn. Like, I'm sorry, man. Those guys are not elite fighters. Like, come on. No one's seen those fighters beating Terence Bud Crawford. Okay? That's why when I had Canelo Alvarez over him in terms of the pound for pound list, I had certain Terence Crawford fans come in here and they said, oh, how can you say that? Terence Crawford's knocking out undefeated guys. Terence Crawford was knocking out C-grade fighters. Okay? Now, don't get me wrong. He was able to recently be the only one to ever knock out Sean Porter, so I give him credit for that. But, don't sit here and try to tell me that Terence Crawford has just as good as a resume as Errol Spence Jr. Come on. You can't even say that. Like, one time I was reviewing an Aki TV video, and because, of course, they want Terence Crawford to be the number one pound for pound fighter, they were literally trying to say that Terence Crawford had the same resume as Errol Spence Jr. just because he knocked out a Kell Brook that was already knocked out twice and completely done with his career, and an Amir Khan who was already knocked out 3 times within his career. And first of all, Amir Khan was never really an elite welterweight anyway. So it just is what it is. Errol Spence Jr. was able to defeat Danny Garcia pretty much at the best point in his career. Never been knocked out. He was also able to beat Sean Porter, never been knocked out. He was also able to beat Kell Brook. He was knocked out by Gennady Golovkin, but he had never lost at welterweight. And he also was able to beat, I believe, the undefeated Mikey Garcia. So the resume clearly has to go to Errol Spence Jr., and that's not even including Yordenis Ugas. So come on, let's not compare resumes, because we're really going to be logical and objective. Errol Spence Jr. does have the better resume. It's really not even all that close.
So at the end of it, at the heart of it, that's what it is. It's a great fight. So I'm not truly mad at anybody for picking either guy. However, I will say from some of the legends that I've heard break it down, I haven't really heard a breakdown that favors Crawford and really intelligently does justice or does what Crawford does well. Like, I think I've said this before. I think Terence Crawford is miscategorized as to who he is as a fighter. No doubt, he's a beast. He's undefeated for a reason. He moved up in weight. First fight was a title fight with Jeff Horn, even though there's some controversy there with Jeff Horn. Did he beat Pacquiao? But that's not Crawford's concern. At the end of the day, Crawford...
Well, just to talk about the Manny Pacquiao-Jeff Horn fight, and once again, I'm a logical, objective person, so I really don't care who gets mad. It just is what it is. That fight was too close, in my opinion. Manny Pacquiao made it too close. Now, do I think that it was as far apart as what the judges tried to make it seem? No, not at all. But at the end of the day, Pacquiao made that fight too close. But just to talk about Ego's point real quick, if we were to talk about an intelligent argument, or if you were trying to make an intelligent argument or breakdown as to why Terence Bud Crawford beat Setup and Errol Spence Jr., you probably would have to bring up the factors that I brought up earlier, which is that of his footwork, which is that of him being the faster fighter, with that of the faster hand speed, and with that, him also having the quicker feet. Those would pretty much be the main reasons, in my view, if Terence Crawford were to win the fight, and also him being the better counterpuncher. What Terence Crawford is going to have to do, in my opinion, in order to win the fight against Errol Spence Jr., is that he's going to have to stick his jab out there. He's going to have to mix it up to the head and the body, which he likes to do. Terence Bud Crawford is a very intelligent fighter. On top of that, he's going to have to use his quicker feet and his quicker hand speed, and the fact also that he has great power as well. Probably power that Errol Spence has never had to deal with so far yet in his career. The fact that Terence Crawford has that type of counter-punching ability and type of power, it's going to be possibly very difficult for that Errol Spence Jr. to get around that. So the question will be, if you were going to argue for a Terence Bud Crawford to win the fight, which once again, this fight is really 50-50, so I don't even know if I can pick a winner at the current moment in time. But, when it comes down to it, if you were going to pick Terence Crawford to win the fight, it would have to be for those reasons. Because I don't think he's as powerful as Errol Spence Jr. I don't think that he has quite the defense or the chin that an Errol Spence Jr. does have. But what he does have over Errol Spence Jr. is that I do think that he has the slight boxing ability over him. I think that all in all that he's slightly more multidimensional than Errol Spence Jr., at least better at being multidimensional, and some may disagree with that. I would say that he's faster. I would say that his feet are quicker. I would say that his hand speed is quicker. And on top of that, he has the type of power that may be able to give Errol Spence Jr. some problems as well. So if Terence Bud Crawford can keep this fight somewhat at a distance, if he can somewhat keep Errol Spence Jr. off of him, make him uncomfortable early to the point to where Errol Spence is somewhat able to, not able to throw his offense like he would with some other fighters, then Terence Crawford could potentially have this fight. But the question will be, will Terence Crawford's power be as much as a factor overall as what Terence Crawford fans would like it to be? Because Errol Spence Jr., he may feel Terence Bud Crawford's power, or he may mainly defend it, and he may still come forward and still try to hit him. And at that point, if that happens, Terence Crawford, in my view, is going to have a very, very tough time in order trying to out-counter and overall out-bully Errol Spence Jr., especially because he does not have quite the defense as what some people overall say that he does. But anyway.
He's a great fighter. But from the breakdowns I've heard that are favoring Crawford, some of it doesn't seem kind of accurate to how Crawford fights. And that will be interesting to see how it all plays out when and if the fight happens undisputed. But to hear Hasim Rahman break down his perspective, interesting. And he kind of said with Paulie Malignaggi, who also favors Errol Spence, one of the same talking points was Paulie Malignaggi and Hasim Rahman have this in common, is that Crawford is the guy who fought at the lower and lighter weight classes, and he is the guy that is moving up, and he's fighting a solid, formidable puncher. And good.
Right, but the size, in my view, is really not going to be as big of a factor as what people overall say. The size, in my view, is not really going to be that much of a factor. In fact, Terence Crawford, one may even debate that he might, of course, Sean Porter, Danny Garcia, at one point in time, I believe even in the amateurs, they maybe once upon a time fought at 154. But Terence Crawford is around their size. So Terence Crawford, when it comes down to it, and Terence Crawford is really, really strong. Especially if you take a look at that last fight against Sean Porter. Sean Porter is a dude that is usually used to bullying folks. And there were certain times that Terence Crawford would literally, he literally had Sean Porter on a leash. Anywhere that he wanted Sean Porter to go, Sean Porter went. He moved him around like it was nothing. Terence Crawford has a little bit more strength than what some people actually know. So to me, the size is not really going to be a big differential. Because Terence Crawford is naturally a big boy. He can compete with Errol Spence somewhat in terms of size, even if he is naturally a tad bit smaller. The question will be can Terence Crawford's chin hold up in the fight, and overall, will he be as defensively responsible as what he needs to be?
Fighter in Errol Spence Jr., so they think that's going to play a factor. And again, without seeing the fight, I could understand that argument, because when it comes to durability, Errol flew through a car, came back and didn't listen to people by taking the tune-up, and then he had an eye injury, came back, did what he said he was going to do, fight the winner of Pacquiao-Ugas, which was Ugas, didn't listen to people. So we know Errol Spence is fully durable, and to this point, Crawford has been durable also, but it's a little bit harder to say with Crawford because he came from multiple weight classes, and we've seen him, I would say we've seen him more hurt or injured or wounded in battle probably more times than Errol Spence Jr. So
that's a fair point, and that's pretty much what I brought up earlier. That's why I'm saying if Terence Crawford is going to win this fight, there is going to be times to where he is going to have to back Errol Spence Jr. up. he's going to have to gain Errol Spence Jr.'s respect early. Because if he does not gain his respect early, if he's not able to hit him quite as accurately as what he initially planned, it could be a very hard night for Terence Bud Crawford. Because Errol Spence Jr.'s power, especially once he starts, wailing on you, it's not easy to deal with.
Until they actually fight and match up, we don't know how to play out, But definitely you can make the argument a bigger person that has skill and power may be able to hurt Crawford. That just goes without saying because we've seen if Gamboa at 135 could hurt Crawford, then it's not out of the question. And it seems like some of the legends, the few, like
Well, a lot of people end up bringing that point up. And even a channel at one point in time that I used to watch and I still watch here and there, although he only has a Patreon channel, Chronicles of Judo 144, who's a very good channel, especially for certain things. Once again, don't always agree with everything that he says, but, he was a very good sports channel as well. And he mentioned that same point with Terence Bud Crawford. But, a lot of people don't seem to mention that certain fighters, even though when they are at a lower weight class, yeah, they can take a punch when it comes down to it overall, or, they may seem to get hurt a little bit more often at the lighter weight classes. Once again, for those of you that don't remember, who grew up in the 2000s, you remember the great fighter Miguel Cotto. Miguel Cotto was in several fights at 140 to where he was stunned a multitude of times. He was stunned against, I believe, that one fight to where he went to hell and back. I believe a guy, what the hell was his name? Some South American fighter, I believe. I don't remember his name. Eventually got in a couple of good fights with Kendall Hoyt. I can't remember the dude's name. But anyways, when it comes down to it all in all, Miguel Cotto was stunned against that guy. He was stunned very badly against DeMarcus Chop Chop Corley. But then eventually, when he got into the bigger fights of his career, his chin seemed to hold the test of time. So Terence Bud Crawford, especially in that latest Sean Porter fight, he showed me that he is somewhat decently durable. But it is possible for him to get hurt. Because not even overall just against Yuriorkis Gamboa, but we've seen it against Mean Machine at the welterweight division. So even though I don't always like the point of people bringing up, oh, well, we've seen it at the lower weight classes, because sometimes fighters, they can change or their chin is less exposed once they get up over the higher weight classes. But I understand overall, what people mean.
Hasim Rahman said, the minority of people that are picking Errol, it seems like that is one of the major points that they're thinking. Now, the thing I like about Hasim Rahman's breakdown, the link will be.
And some people may come back to counter my point. They may say, well, you're playing with Miguel Cotto. He ended up getting knocked out of welterweight twice. Yes, but one of those fights was against the very hard brick puncher, Antonio Margarito. Full pun intended when it comes down to it. Antonio Margarito was using them illegal hand wraps, and Miguel Cotto got knocked out within 11 rounds. And then Manny Pacquiao, we all know how, ferocious that Manny Pacquiao was. And on top of that, Miguel Cotto was at a slight weight drain.
The description as well is when people break down, it's only on YouTube and Instagram and Twitter and stuff, boxing Twitter, that you really see this nonsense. And I'm not going to even spend too much time on it. But Hasim Rahman, what he's saying is plausible. Again, we won't know until they actually fight. But when you come to YouTube, like when I make videos and I make conversation and ask certain questions, people say, oh, Ego, you hating. But Hasim Rahman, you can listen to his breakdown. He's not hating.
Well, there's a difference overall between a logical question and a question that you can clearly tell that is a loaded question. Or is a question to where, that person is full of shit. And it's no offense against Mr. Boxing Ego, but you can tell a lot of the times that Boxing Ego that he is hating on certain fighters. But the reason why he's not really hating on Terence Bud Crawford is because he's not really hating on Terence because he never really tries to tear down Terence. At least not to the same degree as what he would at Canelo Alvarez. Now, when he talks about Canelo or when he talks about Usyk or to B2B, you can tell that he has a completely different energy. But that's because Boxing Ego, he's one of those victim mentality, overall, very big pro-racial type. It just is what it is.
He said, man, I hate to go against Crawford. And that's the reality of real boxing.
Like, let me overall state this, for example, because a lot of people really don't know the difference between a logical question and what hating is. Certain people overall may say, like, if we talk about that of a, I'm trying to think of a good example. Certain people overall, maybe when they talk about a LeBron James, when it comes down to it, the difference between a logical question and maybe overall what a hating question would be. A hating question wouldn't necessarily be that of a LeBron James to where maybe sometimes you see that of a Skip Bayless, to where they say, yes, LeBron James does this, 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 and this, but can he really be that great overall? Because they point to basically all their flaws, but they don't point to any of their advantages, or they don't point overall to any of their positives. They always point out their weaknesses. They never point overall to their positives. Whereas a logical question would be, if we were having a Michael Jordan or LeBron James conversation, certain people may say, yes, well, LeBron James is an all-time great player, but how can you be greater than Michael Jordan, who won 6 championships during his day, and LeBron James has had so many talented teams during his day, and he's only won 4. And 2 of those championships he barely won by the skin of his teeth. So it is what it is. That is a logical question. Okay, there's a difference between a logical question and a hatred-filled question. You have to know the difference.
Is if it's a great matchup, and it's not that you hate Shane Mosley, like Shane Mosley versus Mayweather. We live in such a watered down, sensitive time, and I think there's a lot of people whose hearts ain't pure. I like Shane Mosley. I know.
I would agree that their hearts ain't pure, but when you have conversations, it's really not about whether your heart is pure, at least 100%. It's about whether your mind is pure. It's really about how logical you are. I don't, whenever I talk about these videos, it's not where my heart is, it's where my mind is. I break down things logically and objectively. That's the problem with so many people, including Boxing Ego, because he pretty much just told you what he mainly thinks with
Mosley, right? And him going against Floyd, that's a tall order. It don't matter how much you like somebody, but if you favor Floyd, you favor Floyd, and it should be about boxing. But when it's certain rivalries like Errol Spence and Terence Crawford, people get beside themselves and they start thinking that you have a personal axe to grind or a grudge against one of the person. You know what I'm saying? Me, I haven't even given a fight prediction, and y'all be saying whatever in the comment section. So,
well, it's very obvious that you believe that Errol Spence Jr. is going to win the fight. And I really don't have a problem with that, but I don't really see you hitting on Terence Bud Crawford. I agree that a lot of people, that they get over emotional, but Boxing Ego, Terence Bud Crawford is not really the type of fighter that he's really going to hate on, because Terence Crawford has the complexion for his protection. So Terence Crawford is not really going to be the fighter that he tends to hate on. Canelo Alvarez is a fighter that he usually tends to hate on. And that's an example of hating, when someone never gives credit where credit is due. Asking a logical or objective question, or trying to point out certain flaws in certain narratives, that's not hating. When someone, like for Mayweather or Canelo, for example, when someone basically tries to degrade almost every single opponent, no matter what the situation is, and you want to hold those same standards for other fighters, that's what hating is. All right, that's what hating is. Like Boxing Eagle, for example, whenever he talks about Canelo Alvarez, he says, "Oh, no one wants to see these fighters, even though they're legitimate champions." But then when Gervonta Tank Davis faces a bum like Rolly Romero or Isaac Pitbull Cruz, all of a sudden he has no problem with it. That's what hating is. A logical question is something that you can actually have facts, logic, and an argumentative point for.
there's many different ways to look at it. Some people are picking Crawford. They think he's too agile, swift, cunning, and Errol Spence, you know, he's come from what he's come from, accidents and stuff like that. And I like how Hasim Rahman said a lot of people are overstating those things. And I agree with that statement 1000%. I think people, like, he already went through the car accident and he's already had 2 fights since. He already came back with the eye injury and all that. Like, if you were worried about that, you should have been worried in the immediate following fights. But now he already has 2 in the can. I don't think, like, I would just prepare for the best possible Errol Spence Jr. I wouldn't believe that he's going to show up like this wounded, version where he's like a scavenger just picks him off. That's not what I've seen from his performances. Now, the thing I did disagree with from Hasim Rahman in this interview is he said Errol Spence hasn't looked good. He hasn't looked particularly good in his recent performances. And I don't know why.
Well, he didn't necessarily look as much up to standards. But what I will say is this: I do think that he actually looked pretty decently good against Danny Garcia. But the Sean Porter fight, I thought, was a little bit closer than what it needed to be. Now, I still thought it was clearly 8 rounds before for Errol Spence Jr., but the way that Terence Crawford took care of Sean Porter, I mean, he literally treated him like a dog. I mean, don't get me wrong. The first half of the fight was very, very competitive. I thought it was 9 rounds to 3. But Terence Crawford is still the only one to this day to stop Sean Porter. That does have to be counted into the calculation. So we'll see. And that's going to be a very decent question as well. will Terence Bud Crawford's power affect Errol Spence Jr. in a way to where Errol Spence Jr. will somewhat be nullified? And it could easily go either way in that, equation. So we'll see what happens.
That comment was said, because I don't think that's been the case.
And that's why I believe a lot of people make the accurate comparison to where this is almost like a Sugar Ray Leonard versus Tommy Hearns. This fight almost reminds me of a Sugar Ray Leonard versus Marvin Hagler fight, almost if, those guys were the same size.
From Danny Garcia to Ugas fight, Sean Porter fight, and Mikey Garcia, I don't think that's a right assessment. I thought he looked amazing versus Ugas. And even Danny Garcia, I thought he beat Danny Garcia more punishing off of injury. And then his team said he was like 40, 60, 70% for the Danny Garcia fight. And he was coming off an accident. So I thought he looked sharp in those fights. So that's where we
I thought he looked pretty good.
disagree. But another thing that Hasim Rahman said that I agree with, he said a lot of people think because Sean Porter got knocked out by Crawford that he's the bigger puncher, and I don't believe that. And I'm the same way. No doubt.
I don't believe that he is the bigger puncher either. But what some people fail to grasp is that just because someone is not the bigger puncher, that does not always mean that their punches affect you more. And some people are not going to understand what I mean by that. What I mean by that is that Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Bud Crawford, if it was just a who you could take more punches from contest, yes, Errol Spence Jr. is going to win that fight. But Terence Bud Crawford, in my view, is the better counter puncher. He is the slightly more cunning and higher IQ boxer, at least just slightly in certain terms. And I may be proved a little bit wrong on Fight Night. Who the hell knows? Because both of them are very high IQ level fighters. But Terence Bud Crawford, at least in terms of his punching placement, let me say that, because overall high IQ, you can argue that maybe Terence Crawford has certain deficiencies that Errol Spence Jr. does not have. Like Errol Spence Jr. has a better defense, in my view, for example. But all in all, when it comes down to it, Terence Crawford is a better counter puncher, in my view. He can find his punches a little bit better. Errol Spence Jr., in my view, even though he's a very decent puncher and he can be a very decent counter puncher, he mainly is going to try to wear you down over time. Terence Crawford can almost hit you from any type of angle. That's kind of what he is. So it's going to be very particularly interesting. So a similar opponent may seem to be more affected by that of Terence Bud Crawford's shots, but that's only because his shots with the timing and with the angles, and also there might be more accuracy and a certain amount of more punches landed by Terence Crawford than perhaps what that there is of an Errol Spence Jr. Because when people fight Terence Crawford, you can even see against Sean Porter. Sean Porter, in certain rounds, he cannot move very well without getting countered or running into certain shots, to where Terence Crawford, without Terence Crawford landing certain slamming sledgehammer shots into him. So, it's going to be very interesting. So timing-wise and counter-punching ability, Terence Crawford has that advantage. And it's going to be very interesting to see if Terence is able to take advantage of that.
For strong, he's an animal, but I don't think he's stronger than Errol Spence Jr., who's maiming and disfiguring people's faces and they're looking unrecognizable. But, you hear Roy Jones and some of the other breakdowns, they say it makes it sound like Crawford is stronger. Now, Crawford can hurt anybody at welterweight, and he's a precise puncher. But again, if we're just going per capita, I don't believe that Crawford is stronger. So I agree with Hasim Rahman. Let me know how I did in this video. Subscribe to my channel for the latest and greatest in boxing. Do you agree, disagree with the legend, Hasim Rahman? Who are you favoring, Crawford or Errol Spence? Drop all that in the comment section. We working. And I'm introducing.
But anyways, that's really overall about it for the video today. And this certainly was one of more Boxing Ego's more logical videos where I could really understand his points. Well, I really understand, the majority of people's points, because I see myself as a person that is usually able to see someone's machinations or their meaning or their plans behind a certain narrative. Usually I pick that out very well. But this was one of Ego's more logical videos, and the reason why that is because even though he would prefer, I think, Errol Spence Jr. to win the fight, he really overall, it's not really going to be a big deal if Terence Crawford wins this fight, because there is no racial overall motivation for this fight. But for example, like that of a Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, there's a reason why he predicted Deontay Wilder to win that fight by knockout, even though it seemed, very, very risky to pick that type of way. So Ego, all in all, once again, 75 to 90% of the time, he is going to be more emotional than what he is logical. But like I said, these guys, the majority of the time, they know usually what is logical and what is not. And this was one of those times to where he could be logical because, all in all, there is really no huge risk situation. But anyway, but that's really about it for today. This fight is going to be very particularly interesting if it does happen, which I truly do hope it does. Going to be very, very particularly interesting, and we'll see what happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. And if you're asking me for my fight prediction, I can't necessarily give a fight prediction right now. But if this fight does get signed off on, I certainly will give it probably maybe even a month before when the fight actually even happens. But we'll see what happens. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.